Okay, today we're looking at a 2012 Land Rover HSE. Now, this has their 5-liter V8 engine, and this one happens to be the Jaguar V8. This is the normally aspirated version. The reason why this vehicle is with us today is it has a coolant leak. Now, it's very common for the plastic manifold there in the front of the engine to fail and to leak coolant, and we've had that trouble before, and the rear crossover pipe, which is made out of plastic, for it to actually deteriorate and split and leak. But interestingly enough, that's not why this vehicle is losing coolant. It was actually losing coolant from the housing of the pump for the heater core. So here we see the select solenoids. Now, this particular vehicle has 2 heater cores, one in front and one in the back for the passengers, but the circulation pump was actually leaking, and we've elected to put on a used circulation pump. Seems to be holding up very nicely, so we have corrected the coolant leak. Well, let's talk a little bit about this engine just to start out with. This is the Jaguar V8 engine. I would say this has been a fairly successful engine, has some issues. This is a direct injection engine. We have a high pressure fuel pump, which actually we have 2 of them, which are actually actuated by a separate camshaft there low on the right hand side of the engine. We can't very well see them. They're down there underneath. It's driven by an auxiliary chain. Sometimes they have a tendency to be a little noisy, but on this vehicle they're pretty quiet. Of course, we have coil on plug ignition, as we mentioned, direct injection. This is a normally aspirated engine. I guess they're infamous saying there's no substitute for displacement, so we have plenty of displacement here, and this pushes this vehicle along very nicely. Now, coupled to it is the ZF 6HP26 automatic transmission, and that seems to be holding up very nicely on this vehicle. One thing, we did have some issues with it, but a quick service corrected that. I do not have a dipstick for the automatic transmission. We have to check the fluid level on the side. We elected to go ahead and service the transmission. The transmission fluid was as black as used engine oil, and with a fresh filter and pan, which of course the filter and pan are integral as a unit. They're made out of plastic, and of course a refill of fresh fluid there from the plug on the side. Of course, we didn't try and get the fluid in the torque converter, make sure that fluid level was good and high. It corrected all our problems. So there, we're ready hopefully to go another 100,000 miles. This is a high mileage vehicle, so this has well over 100,000 miles. It's a used vehicle purchased at auction, and we have it here to correct the transmission problem, which was no big issue, and then correct the coolant leak, which seems like we've got that under control. Clean it up real good, and it'll be ready to go on the front line. Okay, here on the Land Rover 5-liter V8 engine, they have a common throttle body, and they actually have 2 inlet ducts. And here I have actually a silencing chamber. This is a resonance chamber there to improve the acoustics there of the intake system. In fact, here I have the small resonance chambers up front, and I have the larger ones here in the back. This is all to improve the sound of the engine. And as we move over here to the driver's side, here we see the left air filter housing. Of course, we have a separate air filter for right and left. There's the same part number, obviously. Here I see the airflow meter that extends down into the duct from the air cleaner to the throttle body. And as we move to the right side of the engine, the passenger side, we see exactly the same thing duplicated here. Here we have the right air filter housing, the right airflow meter, and here we see the corresponding duct going to the inlet of the common throttle body with the 2 acoustics resonance chambers. Here I see my oil filter cap right there. The oil filter is certainly easy to get to here on this vehicle. And as we were mentioning coolant leaks, I'd be looking down carefully in this neighborhood at the water manifold for a coolant leak. It's dry here on this vehicle, and as we mentioned, the crossover pipe in back doesn't seem to be a problem. Now, as we take a quick look at the coolant reservoir, we've filled her up with coolant, and we have operated the vehicle here probably for about 50 miles or so. No problem, no sign of coolant loss whatsoever. So it looks like that circulator pump there for the heater core was our fault. And it was pretty obvious, because as you let the car sit, it would leak coolant there all along the left frame rail and dripping there down to the ground. So it was kind of hiding behind a shield, but it was pretty obvious where the leak was. Just had to let it sit for a while. One interesting thing though is it didn't readily show up with our pressure tester, so a little confusing, but there just a little time with it revealed the problem. Now here on Land Rover, the Range Rover, they like to put their main fuse block here under the engine compartment, and probably a convenient place to put it. Just have to push the tabs back a little bit to get it off. And fortunately they have a legend that lets you know what the fuses are applicable to and what the relays are applicable to. One thing that's interesting though is they're going to kind of a universal language. Obviously we have the horn. I'm going to guess this is the electronic engine control for the engine. There we have a defroster, either front or rear, and I suspect this is the air ride system, and I suspect this has to do with the transmission. There's that defroster again. SM, not real sure. And here it's is that a gear that I'm looking at? There we see what looks like the windshield wiper. Here we're coming across a electronic engine control. Maybe this is the fuel pump. Electronic engine control, electronic engine control. Is that a exhaust gas oxygen sensor heater? Possibly. And some of these others, like this one, does this have to do with kind of forward and back transfer case maybe, or not real sure. Obviously fuel pump, defroster, wiper. Maybe that's the rear wiper. Some of these have a defroster strip there at the base of the windshield. I'm not sure if our Land Rover does or not. Obviously we're looking at, is that headlight washer? Windshield washer? So here this is rather interesting. Obviously some of these are pretty obvious. Horn. And there, let's take a look at them. Here we see the layout of our different relays. And here we see our separate auxiliary fuse block over here on this side. Now, one thing that is nice of them is they do give me some extra fuses. So I do have an assortment of extra fuses. Now, unfortunately, I do need a fuse puller, and that doesn't look like they gave me one, and if they did, it somehow got removed. So it's no longer present there within the fuse relay box. Okay, here we see the battery for the Range Rover. It's here in the engine compartment. Now you're probably asking, the question is, how am I going to get this battery out of here? This is pretty tight. Well, actually they do provide a means for you to do that, and let me show you. Okay, if you take a look here, the strut really isn't very long, and shame on them, they need to make it longer. In fact, be careful, because these struts are a weak point here on the Range Rover, and the hood can come down on you. But you'll notice that they do have this tab and this lock. And what this allows me to do is, if I pop this loose, I can actually open the hood a step further, and this allows me to gain access to items such as the battery windshield wiper motor, master cylinder, brake reservoir, etc. Okay, now here we see the cabin air filter. It's very easy to get to. Be very gentle with this, because what happens here, I have a hinge which is just simply a layer of plastic, so this is easy to break off. So be very gentle with this. In fact, you'd want to be careful doing it in cold weather. And then of course here's the tab. I just simply grab the filter and remove it, and of course it just naturally is retained with these tabs that easily pop up, and they push down easily. Sometimes you need just a little instrument to get behind it to lift it up carefully, and voila, you have access to the cabin air filter. Alright, now this was the source of our coolant leak, and this was rather a strange coolant leak. Hadn't seen this before. But one thing I noticed, that if it's readily available for a low price, that it seems like, hey, it's oftentimes a common problem. And what it would do is it would leak. It's mounted over here on the left side of the engine there, just above the unitized frame rail there. It would drip down onto the frame rail and then drip onto the ground. The engine was of course perfectly dry, but there you'd see that puddle underneath the vehicle. And it was losing the coolant rather slowly, but it was a nuisance, because after, probably a few hundred miles of driving, the coolant reservoir would get low enough to trigger the low coolant lamp and alarm the driver. Now one thing, this was a little bit tricky to disconnect here. Let's take a look at the different connectors for it. Alright, here's the electrical connector. Obviously this is that Bosch style connector. You got to carefully squeeze the wire. Easier said than done with it actually in the vehicle. And of course you should be able to just push it together, but again, easier said than done when it's in the vehicle. Now these are later style European hose connections, and of course the idea is the wire is in the installed position. I actually have to pull this up to release it, but what the idea here is that I just carefully, I put a little silicone lubricant on it to help. And of course there's a tang to keep you from putting it in the wrong orientation. But I simply line it up and push it together. Make sure that it clicks together without any problem. And here we see the other one. Again, there's an alignment tang, so there's only one way that I can put it on correctly. It would happen to, this is actually facing towards the fender well, so it makes it very difficult to get your hook back here to lift that retaining spring up. Fortunately, I just have a hose clamp here, and so here we have the old one. The new one's in position, seems to be nice and dry.